Hi, Modern World History students. We're continuing Unit number 6, the First World War, and today's lesson focuses on Section 4. The first few months of the war, so August, September, even creeping into October of 1914, were pretty fluid. That is to say that the armies were in motion. The armies were in motion. They had not settled down into a kind of a static, unmoving war. But by the end of that period of the first few months, that sort of stalemate had set in. And this lesson is meant to show you how, during 2 months of having armies in motion, the situation developed to a point where the armies then settled in, especially on the Western Front, and suddenly weren't moving very much at all, honestly, for about the next 3.5 years. So I hope that today you'll be able to explain why the Russians attacked early on the Eastern Front and surprised the Germans, but how this became a disaster for the Russians nevertheless. With that, we'll talk about the Russian steamroller and the Battle of Tannenberg. And then I hope you'll be able to explain how Germany's Schlieffen plan, the plan that the Germans had to win the war, despite fighting on two fronts, collapsed by the end of the first 6 weeks of the war. And that will also tie in with the Battle of Tannenberg, but also introduce the Belgian resistance, the Battle of the Marne, and then the construction of networks of trenches. So let's begin the actual fighting. We've had 2 lessons on World War I and not talked about any of the actual fighting yet, but now that part of the story begins. And surprisingly, it begins on the Eastern Front. I say surprisingly because if you remember, Alfred von Schlieffen, in his planning, had basically argued that the Russian army would take at least 60 days to become fully mobilized. Now, the problem, of course, was that once the Russian army became fully mobilized, it was a giant army. It was a giant army with the potential to crush anything in its path. German planners, war planners, and strategists referred to the Russian army as a steamroller. A steamroller. Very slow to get moving, and even very slow once it was moving, but massive and able to crush anything in its path once it got moving. So, for von Schlieffen, in his planning for fighting this two-front war against France and Russia, remember that he had said, we don't really have to worry about the Russians for the first 60 days of the war. It will take them 60 days at least to get their full army mobilized. It's a huge army. It's drawn from the massive numbers of peasants all across Russia. But because Russia is so large, and because Russia has very poor railway networks, it will take them 60 days, like 2 months, to get that army fully mobilized, which is why Schlieffen focused on beating France first. France was the more immediately dangerous threat. So if you remember, in Schlieffen's plan, he had committed only about 1/8 of the German army to holding off any Russians who might show up on the Eastern Front, but he had put 7/8 of the German army into attacking France through Belgium in order to deliver a sort of a knockout punch to the French early in the war. He believed that the Germans could defeat the French in just 6 weeks of fighting. Then the plan was to shift German soldiers back east using Germany's excellent railways to then fight the emerging Russian army. Schlieffen was right about one thing. It did take the Russians at least 60 days to mobilize their full army. As a matter of fact, it took them significantly longer than that. But what Schlieffen did not count on, a possibility that he did not take into account, was that the Russians might attack them without having their army fully mobilized. You see, the Russian army could be fully mobilized and number 1.5 million soldiers, which was an overwhelmingly large army. And Schlieffen was correct in assuming that it would take them at least 30 days to get an army that large fully mobilized. In fact, it took them more than 60 days. But what the Russians did that completely surprised the German planners, now remember that by this time von Schlieffen had died, right? He did not live to see his plan carried out at the start of the First World War. But what Russians did that surprised the German military planners, the generals who took over after Schlieffen died, the Russians actually attacked Germany without their army being fully mobilized. That was a possibility that von Schlieffen and the later German planners had not taken into account. They were thinking to themselves, we have 60 days before the Russians can attack us because it will take them 60 days to fully mobilize their army. What they didn't consider was the possibility that Russia might attack them before their army was fully mobilized. And as a matter of fact, that's exactly what the Russians did. As a matter of fact, just 2 weeks into the war, not 60 days, which is more like closer to 9 weeks, right? Just 2 weeks into the war, the Russian army attacked the Germans with the Russian army only 1/3 mobilized. Well, that was still over 400,000 soldiers. And remember, von Schlieffen had only committed 1/7 of the German army to hold off Russians on the Eastern Front. So the Germans only had about 170,000 soldiers on the Eastern Front. And while that still sounds like a lot, and it is, they were now attacked by 400,000 Russians. And so the Russians caught the Germans by surprise. They did something that the Germans did not calculate. They did something that the Germans did not account for. They attacked when their army was only 1/3 mobilized. And that still caught the Germans horribly outnumbered by a factor of more than 2-1 on the Eastern Front. So this had great potential for the Russians to overwhelm the Germans on the Eastern Front, defeat their armies, and drive toward Berlin. And this could have brought a fairly swift end to the war. So it was a devastating surprise for the Germans potentially, and it held great promise for the Russians. So the Germans, upon seeing this attack sort of coming out of nowhere, they began to retreat. The German army was overwhelmed and outnumbered, and they began to retreat. But of course, they couldn't retreat forever. Germany is not a giant country like Russia, where you can, against Napoleon, retreat and retreat and retreat, and you have hundreds of miles of ground. It was really a matter of only a couple hundred miles to Berlin, the German capital. So they didn't have a bunch of ground that they could give up. And so the Germans sent their two most capable generals, Paul von Hindenburg and Erich Ludendorff, out to the Eastern Front to try to save the day, to take command of this outnumbered German army and somehow save the day against this shocking and surprising and overwhelming Russian attack. The Russian armies were commanded by Alexander Samsonov and Paul von Rennenkampf. Now, listen, I'm not asking you to know the names of these commanders, but because they are part of the story and the story has to be told, I'm giving you their names and giving you their pictures. And if you can remember them for enrichment credit or extra credit, that's fine. But I'm introducing you to them because they're a part of the story. Really, what matters is how this fight came about through this surprise that the Russians sprung on the Germans, and then the outcome of the fight for both the Russians and the Germans. And maybe a little bit about how it played out. We'll get to that. So here's the problem. Samsonov and Rennenkampf, the Russian commanders, they have all of the good stuff going for them. They have the element of surprise, they outnumber the Germans, and the Germans are in retreat. They've got the momentum. The one thing they didn't have going for them was they didn't like each other. And this was a problem in the Russian army. The Russian army, in a lot of ways, was almost like a medieval army, where the soldiers were composed of just regular people, but all of the officers were Russian nobles. In order to be an officer in the Russian army, you had to be a noble, a sort of wealthy landowner. And the Russian noble families were always in competition with each other for the attention of the Tsar, and had been for hundreds of years. And as a result, many Russian noble families didn't like each other. They were rivals of each other. And this was true of Samsonov and Rennenkampf. They were rivals of each other. They didn't like each other. They didn't work well together. Samsonov was the more senior of the two. He was higher ranked. And so Rennenkampf basically had to do what Samsonov told him, but he didn't like it one bit. But for what it's worth, Samsonov had an excellent plan. We talked about how, when we were talking about Napoleon, when you're outnumbered, you're not supposed to divide your army up. You need to keep your army intact and together when you're outnumbered. But on the other hand, when you outnumber your opponent 2-1 or more than that, as the Russians did here, it's a good idea to split your army in two. Look what Samsonov's plan was. He told Rennenkampf to take half of the Russian army, about 200,000 men, which already outnumbered the Germans, all right, who had 170,000, and basically to move on the Germans and sort of engage them, but not to attack them full out. Rennenkampf's job was to get the Germans' attention and keep their attention on him, so that the Germans would be preparing to fight him. In the meantime, uh, Samsonov took the other half of the Russian army, again about 200,000 men, on a long march that would go all the way around the German army. There was a sort of a forested area here, and Samsonov's march would take his army around that forested area, and the idea was that he would then attack the Germans from the flank or the side, or even try to get around behind the Germans, so that then he and Rennenkampf could attack, they could coordinate their attacks and prevent the Germans from escaping. They could destroy the entire German army. If they had simply assaulted the Germans together in one great attack, the Germans could have simply retreated. They could have escaped total annihilation. But Samsonov did not want to allow them to be able to do that, which is why he ordered Rennenkampf to get their attention, but not attack them. Because if you attack them, they might retreat, and you would miss the opportunity. So to move into position for battle, get the Germans' attention. Meanwhile, Samsonov would take the rest of the Russian army on a march around the German position to basically cut off any opportunity that they would have to escape. So this was the plan for what became known as the Battle of Tannenberg. So Tannenberg happened to be the little village that was nearby, and that's why this is called the Battle of Tannenberg. It's a great plan. It's an excellent tactical plan for an army that outnumbers their opponent more than 2-1. And so the plan began to be implemented. Rennenkampf did what he was told. He moved his army into position opposite the German army. He definitely had their attention, but he did not attack them. He held his ground. He kept the Germans' attention, but he held his ground. Samsonov, meanwhile, was moving his army around the German right flank. Okay, this is when you're looking at at an army, when you're thinking about the position of an army on a battlefield, you have to look at it from their perspective. So as the Germans face the Russian army in front of them, it is their right flank, their right, as they face the Russians in front of them, that is about to be attacked by Samsonov or gotten around by Samsonov. But it took Samsonov a lot longer than he had expected, had anticipated. The roads were narrow, there was bad weather, and the march of Samsonov took him a lot longer than anticipated. And Rennenkampf began to worry about that. He became concerned that Samsonov's march was taking too long. And he became concerned that the Germans would figure out what was going on and they would retreat without the Russians inflicting any damage on them. From Rennenkampf's perspective, I've got the Germans right in front of me. I'm afraid they might try to retreat at any moment. If I don't attack them and they escape, we won't inflict any damage on them. And so, without orders from Samsonov, he began a light combat, just some shooting back and forth. He didn't launch a major attack on the Germans, but he began some artillery, that is cannon fire, back and forth with the Germans. Now, the sound of cannon fire travels over miles, and Rennenkampf, was doing this without any authorization from Samsonov, but Samsonov could hear it in the distance, and so Samsonov got on his radio. Now, radio was a new technology being used in the military at that time. The idea that you could communicate with someone wirelessly. I mean, there had been telegraphs and telephones, but both telegraphs and telephones required the use of a wire connecting the two communicators together. The message, whether it was a telegraph, which is just a sort of electric impulses, short and long, using Morse code, dots and dashes, or whether it was the telephone, which is actual voice speaking, that had to be carried, the little electrical impulse that carried the taps or the voice had to be carried along a continuous wire to the person at the other end. Radio was different. You were broadcasting. The voice was being transformed into radio waves and broadcast and received with someone with an antenna, so it was done wirelessly. So this was a new technology on the battlefield, and Samsonov radioed Rennenkampf and said to him, "What's going on? What are you doing?" And Rennenkampf's answer was, "Well, what are you doing, essentially? You were supposed to be in position to begin this attack 2 days ago. Why are you not in position yet?" And Samsonov's answer was, "Well, look, it's taking longer to make this march. The roads are narrower. I've had to divert some of my soldiers onto other roads, but you need to back off." Samsonov's message to Rennenkampf was, "Back off, don't spook the Germans, stop your attack immediately, and hold your position." And as a direct order from a superior commander, Rennenkampf had to do that. It's not like he really had a choice. He was given a direct order from his superior, and whether he liked it or not, whether he liked Samsonov or not, which he didn't, he had to do it. But he was bitter about it. Now, here was the problem. Samsonov and Rennenkampf had been talking via radio over a plan and the conduct of a plan that was supposed to take the Germans by surprise. They were treating the radio like it was wired communication, like only the person at the other end of the wire could hear it. But that's not true with radio. Anyone with a receiver can pick up the message on radio. And the Germans had a receiver. And they had Russian-speaking people in their army to help them with just this sort of thing. So Hindenburg and Ludendorff, the German commanders, were given information, really, by Samsonov and Rennenkampf themselves, because they were listening in on this radio message, or rather, their communications people were listening in on this radio message. And the information that they got from the radio message, both, it informed them, number one, that they were about to be flanked, that Samsonov was trying to march around and catch them from behind. That was information that they didn't have before. Number two, they also got the information that Rennenkampf was now not to attack them until given an order to do so, that he was to back off and hold his position. And Hindenburg and Ludendorff decided to try something very bold, very risky, based on this information. They decided to leave only a small portion of their army in place to hold their ground against Rennenkampf's army, but to shift the bulk of their army south to try to catch Samsonov's army while it was still on the march. Now, sort of, if you remember, we talked about how an army on the march is very vulnerable. Armies march in columns, they fight in rows, and to deploy from columns into rows is a very difficult operation, and a complex and a time-consuming operation. And so what Hindenburg and Ludendorff decided to do was to redeploy their army more to the south. They would leave only a small part of their army in the north to hold their ground against Rennenkampf. They believed that they could do this because they had heard the radio message from Samsonov telling Rennenkampf to hold his position, to not attack the Germans, but to hold his position. They hoped that they could rely on that information, and they also hoped that they could rely on the information that Samsonov's army was on the march and approaching from the south. If this information were true, and if it held, they could surprise Samsonov. They could redeploy their army to the south, catch Samsonov's army while it was still on the march, and have a decent shot at defeating it. Meanwhile, they had to hope that Rennenkampf would not attack their thinned-out army and simply hold his ground as he was ordered to do. And so the Battle of Tannenberg started out with the Russians very much having the initiative. But now, based upon the information they had received from their intelligence, from their radio message listening in, the Hindenburg and Ludendorff were certainly taking a risk, but one which could have potentially a big payoff. And it did. The army of Samsonov marched right into Hindenburg and Ludendorff's trap. The German army was fully deployed for battle. They caught Samsonov's army while it was still on the march, completely unprepared for battle, and they smashed it. Samsonov's army was thoroughly defeated by the Germans, even though they outnumbered the Germans. You're talking about maybe 140,000 Germans facing off against 200,000 Russians, but the 140,000 Germans were fully prepared to fight this fight, and the Russians did not expect it. They marched right into it. Then, having defeated Samsonov's army completely, just annihilated it. The Germans then turned north to do to Rennenkampf what Samsonov was trying to do to them. The larger part of the German army swung up and attacked Rennenkampf's army from the south. The smaller part now pushed them from the west, and they destroyed Rennenkampf's army also. What had started out as a battle with great potential for the Russians, a battle that would afford them the possibility of a total strategic victory, instead became a catastrophe. The Russians lost 78,000 soldiers killed or wounded in this battle, and they gave up 92,000 prisoners. 78,000 killed or wounded, and 92,000 prisoners. The Russian army was so demoralized by this turn of events, this very unfortunate turn of events, that 92,000 of them simply surrendered. The Germans lost only 12,000 killed and wounded. Think for a moment about the massiveness of the Russian losses at the Battle of Tannenberg. When we combine the 78,000 killed and wounded with the 92,000 prisoners that they gave up, the Russians lost 170,000 soldiers in the Battle of Tannenberg. That was the same number of soldiers that the Germans had fighting the battle. It was like each German soldier killed, wounded, or captured one Russian soldier. And that was almost half of the entire Russian force. A devastating victory. A decisive victory for the Germans. A devastating, soul-crushing, catastrophic defeat for the Russians. So soul-crushing that Samsonov, the commander of the Russian army, the night after his army was defeated, went out behind his tent and blew his own brains out. Committed suicide. And that left it up to Rennenkampf to then gather up what was left of the shattered Russian army and begin a retreat back toward Russia. For the Germans, obviously the short-term result of the Battle of Tannenberg was extremely positive. I mean, they were faced with their own potential disaster. Outnumbered more than 2-1, surprised by the Russian move, they faced the potential of having the Russian army plow their army backward and capture their capital, Berlin. Instead, they had completely reversed the course of history at this moment. They had completely reversed the entire momentum by turning it into a catastrophe for the Russians. They now had so many Russian prisoners, they hardly knew what to do with them. 92,000 Russian prisoners. And the Russian army was now in full retreat back into Russia. So the short-term results of the Battle of Tannenberg were excellent for Germany. The long-term results were a little more mixed, because since the Russians had attacked them earlier than they anticipated, right? Since the Russians had attacked them a full 7 weeks earlier than they anticipated, the Germans had to respond to that. They didn't know when the Russian attack, when the early Russian attack, the surprise attack, was first sort of known to them. They didn't know that they were going to win this battle. And so the Germans began to draw off soldiers from the attack on Belgium and France and shift them to the east to defend against the Russian attack. Now, if they had known that they were going to win the Battle of Tannenberg so decisively, they might not have done that. But they didn't know that before the battle. So they were already shifting hundreds of thousands of German soldiers out of the attack on the Western Front and sending them to the Eastern Front to reinforce it and deal with the fact that the Russians were attacking them before they were expected to do so. Now, even after the battle was over, with the Russians in retreat, the Germans saw an opportunity to invade Russia, follow up their victory, and potentially end the war quickly on the Eastern Front. So the thousands of soldiers that they had shifted from the attack on France to the east stayed in the east. This allowed the Germans to invade Russia and capitalize on their big victory at Tannenberg. But it also meant that the German attack on Belgium and France was not as strong as it was supposed to be. It was not as strong as von Schlieffen had designed it to be. And so that's going to have an impact on what goes on the Western Front. So it was good news in the short term, but mixed news in the long term for the Germans as a result of what had gone on the Eastern Front in the first month of the war. On the Western Front, the Germans began their invasion of Belgium. The Germans had hoped that the Belgians would simply sort of stand aside and let the German army pass through. I mean, the German army was so much bigger than the Belgian army. The Belgians hardly had an army at all. And so the German expectation was that the Belgians would sort of step aside, not challenge the Germans, not want to get just crushed. But that's not what happened. The Belgians decided to resist the German invasion of their country with every bit of strength that they had in them. Um, they fought the Germans, for every little town and every little village. Um, the roads through Belgium were great roads for the German army to pass along, but all of them passed through towns and villages and even big cities. And so wherever the German army entered a big city, the Belgian army and just Belgian civilians who had armed themselves to resist the invasion, they resisted the Germans. They fought the Germans for every town, every village, and every city block. They holed up in they fired at the Germans from windows and doorways and from alleys. They forced the Germans. They contested every city block, every house, every street. They fought the Germans, and it was difficult. It was difficult going for the Germans until finally the Germans decided to, instead of trying to move their army through each town and fight the Belgians for every street and every block and every house, the Germans, as they approached a town, they would simply bring up their artillery and they would bombard the town. They would blast the town into rubble, and then they would pass through. As a result of this, almost all of the major towns and cities in Belgium were almost completely destroyed during the German invasion in August of 1914. If you go to Belgium and you travel around in the major cities and towns, you'll see buildings that appear to be hundreds of years old, but most of them aren't. Most of them are reconstructions built after the First World War, rebuilt to look like they had for hundreds of years, based on photographs and drawings and sketches and things like that. But many of them are not the original buildings because the Germans, rather than trying to fight the Belgians sort of inch by inch, yard by yard, and foot by foot for each of these towns, the Germans simply chose to blast the towns into oblivion with their artillery. Still, the Belgians slowed the Germans down significantly in their progress through Belgium. The Belgian resistance had the effect of really knocking Schlieffen's plan off its timing. And remember, the thing really relied on timing so much. But because the German army was not as large as it was supposed to be, since they had shifted thousands of soldiers to the east to fight the Russians earlier than expected, and because the Belgians now resisted, instead of standing aside and letting the German army simply pass through, the timing of the Schlieffen plan was significantly affected by this. It was significantly slowed down. And the hope of actually defeating France in the first 6 weeks of the war, which is what the plan sort of relied on, was slowly ebbing away. The Germans, however, did, of course, conquer Belgium, and they occupied it for the remainder of the war. German soldiers committed some horrific acts of atrocity against Belgian civilians. There were incidences of Belgian civilian women being raped by German soldiers, torture of children by German soldiers. And the Germans basically extracted all of the food from Belgium. All of the food that was being produced in the Belgian countryside was taken to feed the German army. And so many Belgians starved to death as well. It's believed that at least 5,000 Belgian civilians died during the German invasion and occupation. And as you can see here, the rape of Belgium became a propaganda point for the Allied powers. In Britain, for example, where they were relying on a volunteer army and they were trying to persuade people to volunteer for service to fight the Germans, the stories of what the Germans had done in Belgium were used and to some extent even exaggerated to try and encourage people to sign up and join the war and fight the Germans. Also, as the Allied powers propagandized the United States in hope that we would join their war, they used the stories, sometimes exaggerated, of German atrocities in Belgium to sort of get the American people on the side of joining the war on the side of the Allies. Well, however delayed and however sort of reduced in terms of numbers, the German army nevertheless crossed over the Belgian border into France right around the beginning of September 1914. They were behind schedule. They were reduced in numbers. Um, their numbers were supposed to have been about 1.1 million. If their numbers had been 1.1 million, they would have outnumbered the French by about 20%. But their numbers were closer to 900,000 because 200,000 German soldiers had been shifted to the east to fight the Russians, since the Russians had attacked earlier than expected. As a result of this, the Germans, who had intended to have, as I said, a significant numerical advantage over the French, didn't. The numbers of German soldiers who crossed over into France were pretty close to even with what the French could offer up. And so that idea of an overwhelming force, that idea of having this overwhelming numerical advantage over the French and throwing a knockout punch right at the beginning of the war and defeating France within 6 weeks was looking less and less likely. The German army had been slowed down by the resistance of the Belgians. It had been reduced in numbers by the early attack of the Russians. And still, 900,000 German soldiers were now approaching the city of Paris. They were approaching from the north. The city of Paris was defended by about 900,000, 800 to 900,000 French soldiers and a small army of less than 100,000 British soldiers. This was all that the British could muster. I mean, at least at the beginning of the war. In this sense, Schlieffen had been right. The war happened quickly enough that the British weren't able to send a large army to help the French defend themselves. Nevertheless, an army of just under 100,000 men could make a difference, particularly since the German army was reduced in the number of men that it had available, since so many of them had been sent east to fight the Russians. Nevertheless, the German army was now approaching Paris. They were 50 miles away, and they were about to cross the Marne River. So this is the Marne River here. The river that flows through Paris is called the Seine, and then the Marne is a tributary of the Seine. The thing is that by now, the Germans knew that they didn't have quite the numbers they were supposed to have, and they knew that the French and the British had sort of dug in. They had built strong trenches and defensive positions around the north side of the city of Paris. And so the German commanders decided that instead of attacking Paris directly, the way that they had originally intended to, instead of attacking Paris directly, what they would do is they would swing their army way out to the east of Paris and attack Paris from the east side. This was a clever idea because it would force the British and French soldiers then to shift their defense from the north side of Paris to the east side as well. And while the Germans knew that they couldn't hide this move, I mean, clearly you can't hide a 900,000 army moving way out east of the city. What it would still force the British and the French to do is give up the strong defensive positions that they had dug and created north of Paris and face the Germans just on an open field of battle east of Paris. So they weren't expecting to fool the British and French and attack the east side of Paris and have the British and French not realize it was happening. But what they did intend was to force the British and French to move out of their strong defensive positions north of Paris into new positions east of Paris where they weren't as dug in or well protected. And so the German army began their march. Now, the problem with this was that it was very risky, not for the half of the German army that was more to the north and therefore farther away from the Allied armies, but rather for the portion of the German army that was farther south, whose flank, whose right side, would almost brush up against the Allied armies as they made this big move out to the east. The commander of that part of the German army, Alfred von Kluck, was sort of a nervous character. And he was afraid that as his army passed the Allied armies, they would attack him, and he'd be caught. They'd be attacking his flank. It's very hard to defend against. So what Kluck's army did is, instead of making a nice big swing out to the east like he was supposed to, he kind of shuffled his army. He would move out to the east and then pivot back toward the Allies, move out to the east and pivot back, each time trying to make sure that he didn't get caught off guard. The problem is that he moved his army. As a result of this, there was this sort of gap that opened up between the one half of the German army, the half that was moving confidently to the east, and then the other half of the German army, Kluck's half, that was kind of shuffling. This sort of gap opened up, and the German army became separated into two parts. The French were determined to take advantage of that, and so they attacked. They attacked along the banks of the Marne River. They first attacked Kluck's part, which was the closer part. This left the British sort of with an opportunity. And since there was this big gap between the two parts of the German army, the British stormed into that gap and sort of occupied it. Now they were in an interesting position because they were in a position now to support the attack by the French being made on Kluck's half of the German army. They could now attack his half of the German army, and so that the Germans would be fighting on two sides here. Or they could wait and assist this half of the French army when they came to grips with the Germans here. So the British were in a very strong position. Even though they were small in number, only 100,000 men, by storming into that position, by storming into that gap that separated the two parts of the German army, they now were like a wild card in this battle. They could support the French here, or they could support the French here. The Germans realized that although their plan had been a good one, they had executed it poorly. And they realized that now their armies, both halves of their army, were vulnerable to being what's called flanked, that is, attacked from the side by the British, while being engaged in their front by the French. And so, realizing that their plan had not played out the way that they intended, the Germans retreated. They backed off, and they sort of called off the battle. The battle was therefore essentially a stalemate. Both sides lost around 250,000 casualties. This is a battle of 500,000 casualties, 500 killed, wounded, and missing. 250,000 for the Allied soldiers, 250,000 for the Germans. And so it was kind of a stalemate. The Germans had attempted to fulfill the Schlieffen plan. They had come within maybe 20 miles of the city of Paris, which was their objective, but they had not captured the city of Paris. They had been driven back as a result of bad execution of a decent plan, and as a result of the timely action of both French and British soldiers. Now both sides sort of hunkered down and prepared to be attacked. The Germans expected that the Allied soldiers would counterattack. The Allied soldiers expected that the Germans would now renew their attack on Paris. And so both sides prepared to play defense. They began digging trenches to protect themselves against the attack that they expected. The Germans began digging trenches, expecting a counterattack from the Allies. The French and British began digging trenches along the Marne River, expecting the Germans to renew their attack. So with both sides expecting to play defense, nothing happened. It settled into this sort of stalemate. And as a result of that 6-week period, as a result of Germany's inability to capture Paris, or as a result of their inability to drive back the British and French at the Battle of the Marne, Germany's plan to defeat the French and end the war in 6 weeks was defeated. The Schlieffen plan was defeated. The Schlieffen plan had failed. Remember, the entire thing had relied on timing. The entire thing relied on the premise that France could be defeated in the first 6 weeks of fighting. Now that wasn't going to happen. And so, 6 weeks into the war, Germany's entire plan for winning the war had failed. It had failed because the Russians had surprised the Germans by attacking them earlier than expected. It had failed because in response to that, Germany had shifted 200,000 soldiers to the Eastern Front from the Western Front to fight the Russians. Now they weren't available to deliver that knockout punch, that overwhelming force against the French and British. It failed because the Belgians had resisted the Germans and slowed them down in their advance through Belgium. And finally, it had failed along the banks of the Marne River, where the German attack was well conceived but poorly executed, and the British and French had taken advantage of it. So, for all those reasons, Schlieffen's plan, which was a clever plan to fight a two-front war and win, nevertheless was wrecked by the end of September 1914. The question then was, what would the nature of this war be? If it would not be a fluid war in which armies were in motion, what would it turn into? What it turned into was a 3.5-year-long stalemate, particularly on the Western Front, which was characterized by what's called trench warfare. And we'll get to that trench warfare in our next lesson. But for now, we're done. So take good care of yourselves, stay healthy and stay safe, and we'll talk to you again soon. Bye-bye.